Weeks. I am the Assistant Director of the SMU Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center. Here at the center, we have 5 focus areas, which are trade and investment, energy, human capital and education, border issues, and of course, what we'll be hearing today, migration. The Texas-Mexico Center, we fund research every year, and today you will actually be seeing the information presented from one of those research projects that we funded that Dr. Andrew Selee, who is the president of the Migration Policy Institute, completed for us. We're very grateful to have him join, and Dr. Hollifield will be introducing him in just a moment. But first, I will introduce Dr. Hollifield. Dr. Hollifield is the acting director of the Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center. He is also the director of the Tower Center and holds a chair in international political economy and is a professor of political science here at SMU. He will be moderating the conversation today with Dr. Selee, and I want to mention before I turn the time over to him that throughout the event, please, if you have questions, we will have a Q&A session at the very end. Feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and then those will be answered during the last portion of our presentation. So thank you very much again for joining, and I will turn the time over now to Dr. Hollifield.
Okay, well, thank you, Courtney Weeks, and welcome to this Texas Mission Foods Texas-Mexico webinar. We're thrilled to have someone whom I greatly respect and admire, who's been a colleague for decades, actually, Dr. Andrew Selee. I think I may have first met him as a graduate student when he was in Latin American Studies at the University of California at San Diego, going back to the 1990s. But it's been my pleasure to work with Andrew Selee, both at the Wilson Center, where I served as a fellow, and also at the Migration Policy Institute. We've got lots of collaborative projects with MPI. Dr. Selee is an expert on international migration, a great background in studying and writing about U.S. immigration policy and politics. And for those of you who know a little bit about his work, he's one of the great scholars of Mexico and Latin America, has brought lots of projects to MPI focused on Mexico, Central America, Latin America. So this is one of those projects, and you can find the paper report on our website. And you will quickly see, if you have any trouble understanding the maze of visas that we have in the U.S. immigration system, this piece will help you understand how the U.S. does or doesn't manage legal migration to the country and what kind of visas we have. So just one final point before I turn it over to Andrew Selee. We're going to be talking about migration management, and what the U.S. does well, what the U.S. does not do well. And there's always been this idea that if we just manage the front door well, we can close some of the back doors and side doors. And if we can get more legal immigration, more pathways, then this will help us manage the unauthorized or undocumented migration. So I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Selee, and he's going to walk us through the project and the research, and we'll leave lots of times for Q&A. So, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be with Dr. Hollifield here, someone who's a good friend and admire greatly. Great to be at the SMU Mission Foods Texas-Mexico Center. I have been engaged on and off through the years with the work of the Texas-Mexico Center. I think do fabulous things focused on what is really an intense bilateral relationship between the two countries, with Texas at the center of it. And great to be at the Tower Center as well, though it be virtual, but I do visit you, about once a year or so. So that is, I was trying not to be too far away, and we really appreciate the opportunity to work together on this project. We often focus on unauthorized immigration from Mexico. Some would call it illegal immigration, some would call it undocumented immigration. I'm going to stick to the technical term of unauthorized immigration. And that is, it has been a big part of the relationship in the past, a big part of the movement of people between the two countries. But in fact, one of the things that has escaped most of us is how much legal immigration is actually growing between the two countries. And there was a period where unauthorized immigration really dropped from about 2007 until about 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, the numbers went significantly down until post-COVID. They went up after COVID. I think it's a result partially of the middle class being particularly hit during COVID, and particularly regional middle classes losing some of their assets during COVID, as well as poor people losing some of what they had. But it was particularly noticeable in much of Latin America, where you have sort of the lower and middle classes being particularly hit, who thought they were on the rise. And also the ease of crossing the border, that it did become, the more people arrived at the US border, the more it was, it became very hard to turn people back. And so, a lot of people tried it because they could, because they thought this was the moment to go. And so we did see a rise in Mexican unauthorized immigration. But we do suspect that part of the story, and now it's gone down again, it started going down actually in January of last year, 2024. So the Biden administration went down significantly more from July on, and then has gone significantly down even further after the inauguration of Donald Trump as president of the United States. And we have, right now, the largest number of people coming unauthorized to the US are coming from Mexico, followed by Guatemala, but the numbers are really, really small. We think that the existence of legal pathways was one of the reasons why the numbers went down after 2007. You'll see the numbers in a minute. We don't think it's sufficient. We think it also has to do with fertility in Mexico, better improvements in the economy in Mexico as well. I mean, other things that are going on here besides that. So it's a piece of the story, but it's a piece that's often overlooked. And so we wanted to look at this. I'm very thankful to SMU Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center, because we were able to do this. And I should say this, much of the research was done by my colleague Ariel Ruiz. He deserves a great deal of credit for this, and we worked on it together, but he ran a lot of the numbers, and we are colleagues in many of these ventures. So he's not with us today, but I want to acknowledge that this was really a joint effort. So if we put the PowerPoint up, I'm going to walk you through this. It's fairly simple, actually. I mean, this is not so Ariel G. Soto and me, we can go to the first slide. So we've seen a growing, oh, by the way, we looked at Central America. I should say in this, we also looked at Central America because we thought that was another part of the story. What you'll see is that the numbers went up proportionally, in some cases, much more from Central America, but they're much smaller compared to the populations of those countries than they are compared to Mexico. The legal immigration streams are still much more new and much smaller than they are from Mexico, but they're in there. You'll see them shortly. There's a mix of permanent residents. This is not surprising. Once people become permanent residents, that is green card holders in the United States, they can apply for their spouses and children, and in some cases, siblings to come, and parents, the more limited options there, but possible, to come to the United States as green card holders as well. So not surprising. The more Mexicans who became legal, and this was particularly true in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the more people there was a large number of Mexicans who could then apply for others to come, and then they apply for others as well. So not surprising you see that, but you will also see that a lot of Mexicans and Central Americans are coming, especially Mexicans, are coming on non-permanent and temporary or seasonal visas. There's slight difference between temporary and seasonal. Seasonal is particularly tied to certain seasons. Temporary could be longer than a season, usually isn't in this case, but technically different. But these are non-immigrant visas in terms of the United States. These are visas that allow people to come, usually work in the United States for a period of time or study in the United States, and then return home. That said, I will say at the end, the panorama may change in the future. Things are changing very quickly in the world of immigration, as you know. So there are things that could change quicker than we expect, and we'll go into those at the end. But let's go through the numbers. So thank you, Courtney. If we can go to the next one. So there's a significant number of Mexicans and Central Americans who move to the United States each year because they get a green card. These are arriving green card holders, or arriving lawful permanent residents. There are two different groups that get green cards. There are people who get green cards in their home country and then come to the United States. And there are those who are already in the United States and are adjusting status from the United States. And so we've separated these out. These are just the new arrivals. So you can see the numbers of people who are coming for the first time to the US, right? They haven't been in the US. And what you see is that, the numbers have been fairly steady. It drops during COVID. There's not a sort of huge, upswing, but it is fairly steady. When you look at somewhere between 60 and 100,000, 60 and 95,000 Mexicans who come to the United States each year, except for the COVID years, as permanent residents, that adds up over time, right? That adds up over a decade, over 2 decades. You start to see large numbers of people who come in legally. So this perception that most Mexicans came here through unauthorized journeys certainly was true at another moment. And at some point, actually, Mexicans were the majority of the unauthorized population of the United States. That does not seem to be true anymore. And they're a bigger part of the legal immigration stream than before. Central American numbers, you can tell Salvadorans, who have a much longer history of migration, also have a significant number, a much smaller number, but a significant number coming every year. And then Hondurans and Guatemalans, it's much smaller numbers, much more recent migration, fewer people that are in the US with green cards or citizenship. Let's go to the next one. The next one tells you all lawful permanent residents, all people who get a green card in a given year. And there you see, this includes the ones who are already in the US and are adjusting status within the US. That, it's ranging somewhere between, even in COVID, it's still about 100,000. And then in some years gets close to 200,000. So these are new, legal permanent residents from Mexico in the United States each year. Again, Salvadorans are the second biggest group for the same reasons as before. And you see much smaller numbers of Guatemalans and Hondurans. You do see Guatemalans and Hondurans, but again, much smaller numbers. So the legal immigrant population from all 4 of these countries is growing, with a particularly noticeable growth from Mexico. Some of these people, by the way, were in unauthorized status. Some people here are going from being in authorized status to being green card holders. Some people are coming for the first time. They weren't in the US, right? The numbers we saw before, and they're coming for the first time to the US with a green card. And some may have had other statuses. It's a little bit less with Mexicans and Central Americans, but a few people, if you have a high-skilled visa or a TN NAFTA visa, and you marry someone who's a legal permanent resident or citizen of the United States, you might also adjust from that temporary status into a permanent status. So this is the whole panorama. Courtney, let's go next to the next one. But there are a lot of other categories, and there is no test at the end of this discussion here. Don't feel like you have to memorize this. I'm not sure I've memorized it yet. The visa categories are incredibly complicated in the US. They are not the product of some big negotiation that, people thought through what the best visa system was. It's sort of iterative negotiations where different categories were created and then refined over time. But the big ones, let me go to the big ones first. The big ones, the H-1B, which are temporary workers in specialty occupations, what we call high-skilled visas. It tends to be dominated by Indian citizens and then Chinese next, but Indians overwhelming number. But as you will see, there are some Mexicans and Central Americans. The other 2 big ones are the H-2As and the H-2Bs. These are temporary agricultural workers and temporary workers not in agriculture and everything else. They tend to be in hospitality, sometimes in gardening, things a little bit, a touch in some manufacturing, although much less so, and in dairy, which is actually counted there and not in the agricultural one. The other big one, of course, they're all Fs and Js are big ones. They are educational. The Fs are actually for students, people who are coming to vocational schools, undergraduate, graduate school, and N1 as well. And then J1s are exchange visitors. If you are a visiting professor, you're likely to have that. But maybe if you're a visiting student who's taking a semester, you're going to SMU for a semester because your university in Mexico has an exchange program with SMU, you'd be on a J1 visa. However, within J1 visas, it's worth saying that increasingly they're being used for educational opportunities by the private sector as well. So if I was driving around last summer in South Dakota, Wyoming, and Colorado with my oldest daughter, and we kept running into Latin Americans there, and we would ask them what they were doing there. They were on J-1 visas, and they were, having a learning experience by, waiting tables at a restaurant in a tourist area. They were having a learning experience by selling souvenirs in one case. They were doing, a lot of them are on ski slopes. Now, the requirement is you have to be in an educational program in your home country, right? And so you're doing this as sort of a professional training of sorts. But it has become sort of an alternate approach to recruiting workers for some of these short-term occupations. Ls, I will tell you about also just because I think they're important. Ls are intercompany transfers. They're not that important for Mexico and Central America, but because the H-1B program, the high-skilled visas are so hard to get, and there's a cap on them and a lottery, increasingly what companies are doing is actually hiring people somewhere else in the world and then transferring them after a year under an intercompany transfer, because the L visas are not capped. And so we've actually seen a huge growth. It is not that important for Mexico and Central America, so you don't have to memorize it. But you don't have to memorize any of this, by the way. But for those that want to know, L visas are becoming much more significant because companies have realized that H-1Bs are a lottery, right? You never know if you're going to be able to get that worker that you want to hire if she or he is going to actually win the lottery, or you're going to win the lottery requesting them. And so the Ls are a much more secure alternative, and that's really exploded recently. And then C1 and D is actually crew members of sea vessels at international airlines. I mean, there is some of this you'll see in Central America with, cruise ships, actually. And then P1 are temporary workers, athletes, artists, and entertainers. Sometimes these are just people coming in for a specific event, like say those that will, come to the World Cup next year, those that are going to come to the Olympics. But sometimes there are people who come for a longer period of time, right? They're playing in a league. They're actually part of a longer, and are actually living in the US for a longer period of time. Okay, now we'll go to the numbers. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, everyone. I hope I didn't put you all to sleep, by the way. I can't see you, but I'm just trusting that I didn't completely put everyone to sleep, maybe a few people. Okay, so here is the total number of non-immigrant visas. Well, we say non-immigrant, it means it does not allow you to stay permanently in the country. There may be pathways to stay permanently, but the visa itself does not confer permanence on you in the United States, right? If you marry an American, there may be cases where you can transition to a green card, particularly to high-skilled visas, but generally speaking, these are non-immigrant visas because they're not set up to give you permanence in the U.S. So there's always been a lot, right? So Mexicans and Central Americans total, what you see is that it's grown, actually. This is where, unlike the permanent visas, unlike the green cards, which have been somewhat steady, very significant, right? And they're important because people are coming and staying permanently. These visas have really shot up. So from about, under 200,000, now we're talking about over 500,000 people who come from Mexico and Central America each year on these temporary and seasonal visas. Now the next one. The H-2As and H-2Bs are the most important ones for Mexico and Central America. As I mentioned earlier, these are the ones that H-2A is agricultural, H-2B is everything else that's seasonal. Here you see an enormous expansion. H-2As, the agricultural visa, is uncapped. And so increasingly, you'll see in a second that the vast majority are Mexicans. There have been recruiting networks that have developed in Mexico for people to come to U.S. farms. One of the things we know is that, increasingly the farm workforce in the United States is aging out. Most people who have arrived as immigrants to the U.S., including unauthorized immigrants, don't tend to go to farm work, which is actually, we thought actually during the Biden administration, when lots of people were arriving unauthorized, you would see suddenly a huge injection of people into the rural workforce of the United States. It did not happen. Generally speaking, farms are discovering that they don't have the workforce they need, and they're using the H-2A program, which is uncapped. So it's only capped by the willingness of farm owners to go out and do recruiting, and the recruiting companies that are the mediators for this. And so you've seen a huge growth to this. And you've seen a smaller but also significant growth in H-2Bs as well, because those are capped. They're capped at 66,000. The Secretary of Homeland Security has the ability to increase that number, which is why it goes up in some years. But I think the top number you can get to is about 130,000, just slightly over that. So it is within a range, and it is set in law, so it's hard to change. Go to the next one. Okay, so this is just Central Americans. What you will see, we were talking about how many, let's go back to the last one for a second, Courtney. So we're talking about, we're getting up towards 360,000 H2As and H2Bs together. Now let's go ahead. So of that, Central Americans are a small piece, right? I mean, even at their maximum, you can see a huge increase here. They're only 25,000, not even 25,000 out of that. So the story of Central America in this program is that there's a huge increase among Guatemalans in particular, and also Hondurans and Salvadorans coming on H2A and H2B visas. But out of, almost 400,000 visas, they're still under 25,000. These are still predominantly Mexican visas. The two big temporary seasonal visa pathways are overwhelmingly Mexican, with some significant growth. However, the Biden administration put a lot of effort into trying to create, because so many Central Americans were coming, to trying to create recruiting networks and create incentives. And they did set asides. Actually, the first Trump administration had the original idea of a set aside for Central America. And then it got canceled because of COVID, and then the Biden administration resurrected it. And that created some reason for farmers to look to Central America, because there was a number restricted for recruitment in Central America. But even so, it remains a small part of the overall numbers. Now, of course, these are smaller countries, but proportionally, Mexico is still by far and away the biggest source. Let's go to the next one. So how about high-skilled visas? I mean, this is interesting. We debated whether we should even look at this. No one really talks about Mexican high-skilled workers, but it turns out we ran the numbers, and it's not insignificant. What you see is that anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 Mexicans come each year. Again, COVID, it dropped down a little bit below that, but 2,000 to 4,000 each year on H-1B visas. Now, that's nowhere close to the number of Indians that come. But it is significant, actually. It is a significant number. We don't often think about Mexicans coming as university professors and engineers and architects. But indeed, Mexico has a college graduation rate very similar to the United States. It actually produces more engineers every year than the United States does, an area that Mexico is particularly invested in. Mexico increasingly has quite high human capital. Not always equal opportunities for everyone that has high human capital. But so increasingly, we're seeing Mexicans as part of the H-1B visa flow. Again, not at the rates of Indian and Chinese nationals, but significant. Much less so on Central Americans, which is the other three colors there. Next. There's also this special NAFTA visa. I realize NAFTA no longer exists, but we keep calling it the NAFTA visa because it was part of the NAFTA agreement. Now it's the USMCA. And it's called the TN visa in the United States. It is different. Here I'm going to make it sound really complicated, but it is different for Canadians than it is for Mexicans. Ignore the blue line, because though we put it in there, the fact that only 7% are Mexicans is a technicality. Canadians can get a TN visa by showing up at a border post and requesting a TN visa. Mexicans have to go to the US consulate. And so Canadians will get, a Canadian who's working in the US but goes back to Canada may have 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 visas in a given year. So of course, there are many more that go to Canadians. We've not actually been able to get a good number of people, on Canadian individuals who have TN visas, to be able to compare this. In fact, it's hard. It is doable, but we have not been able to do it yet. It's not with the existing public information, you can't do it. You'd have to actually reconfigure the DHS data a bit differently on their side. But what you do see here is a huge increase, right, in the number of people that come on TN visas. These are high-skilled and middle-skilled. What you actually see is many more people use the TN visa than use the H-1B visa. It's much easier to get. It has a list of occupations that are included. And it's not a huge number of people, but it has gotten up over 30,000, which is significant. And so that has become another way that Mexican professionals come to the United States to take jobs in the US and come in legally. There has been an attempt under the current administration in the US to reduce the number of categories. I have not seen the final list, but apparently they have tried to cut down on it. But historically, it's been interpreted quite expansively. So people in a wide range of professions are able to come on a TN visa. Next. So what are the policy challenges? I mean, one thing that Professor Holofield said at the beginning, and I will echo, is that we've always seen the possibility that growth in legal pathways, legal ways of coming from Mexico to the United States, and now Central America to the United States, would take pressure off of unauthorized immigration. It's probably not in and of itself sufficient to do that. But if you combine it with enforcement that discourages people from coming on unauthorized journeys, with improved development in Mexico, with the changing fertility patterns, by the way, fertility rate in Mexico is very similar to fertility rate in the US. It is not a country, Mexico's gone very quickly from the early 1970s to today, dropping from, average of 4 or 5 kids per family to less than 2 kids per family, below replacement rate. So there are lots of reasons why unauthorized immigration could stay low, but having legal options is certainly one of these, right? And there certainly has been a shift away from unauthorized into legal channels, except for those 4 years where there really was a spike in unauthorized migration again. And I think we're back to it again, back to having more legal immigration than unauthorized. We do see, as I said a second ago, we see the current administration narrowing criteria for TN visas, but there was also some interest in this administration and the Trump administration in making seasonal visas, particularly agricultural visas, easier to access. Now, we haven't seen anything concrete on this, but we know they've sent signals to some of the growers that they're going to try and make it easier. We'll see what that turns into. The future is uncertain, but we're unlikely to be in a position where we see migration from Mexico and Central America to cease. But it may turn more into legal channels. And by the way, the fact that there are so many people born in Mexico who are now green card holders or citizens of the United States who can then petition for other family members, we can be almost ensured that those numbers will continue and add on to that those that are in the temporary chains. And with that, we can go to questions and discussion.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think I will kick off the discussion by posing a few broad questions for you. We can have a little back and forth, and then I want to especially encourage those who've joined us online to put a question in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many of those questions as we can. So I think at the end of the presentation, you addressed this issue that I raised at the beginning, which is, do the legal pathways take pressure off people who want to come here, give them more options in how to get here, combined with enforcement? And we know about the big demographic transition that's happened in Mexico and is happening in Central America, I might add. So yes, the numbers are going to go down. There are going to be far fewer people to come here. So, there have been some recent CBO, Congressional Budget Office studies looking at what's happening with the American population and our labor market. And we know that there is a big disjuncture between labor supply in this country, especially in certain sectors, and the demand for labor. I think this is especially true at the extremes of the labor market. We don't have enough low-skilled people. We don't have enough people, high-skilled people. So could you tell us a little bit about how your work addresses these issues of the demand for labor in the American labor market?
Yeah, if we believe the CBO projections, the Congressional Budget Office, we did a study recently that showed, actually, my colleagues, Julia Gillette, Michael Fix, and John Badalova, not me, but that showing that almost all, if not all, labor market growth in the United States since 2000 has come from immigrants and the children of immigrants.
Yep.
Now, the children
Yep.
are usually American born. So, if you put those two together, usually we don't count that as immigration, but if you put those two together, one of the things we know is that children of immigrants, immigrants tend to have more children on average than the native born. That goes away by the third generation.
Yeah.
But the second generation is much more like Native Americans, like Americans who are Native, not Native Americans, the native-born Americans, and so it doesn't hold much longer. But on average, it is a slight difference, and so immigration has really driven the increase in the number of workers in the United States as the economy has expanded. And very soon, if we believe the CBO projections, it will be the only source of population growth in the United States. Immigration, we're getting below replacement level, and some people suspect we're already there. Actually, there's some demographers who think we're already below replacement level. New Mexico is not far behind. El Salvador is not far behind Mexico. Guatemala and Honduras are a little further out. I mean, so there will still be some pressure for migration because the U.S. market will need people. There's enough of an inequality of wages and difference of wages between the U.S. and Mexico and Central America that even if those countries are below replacement rate, there will still be some benefits from coming to the United States. It'll be fewer, but it'll still be there, right? And it'll still be possible to attract and attract people from other places in the world, right? And the U.S. is still an attractive place to go unless we blow that. So I mean, there is we're likely to be able to survive this period depending on our immigration policies, right? And whether we think of immigration as labor market policy and as economic policy. And I'm fond of saying, we're moving into an era where we better think about immigration in the context of economics and not as sort of this isolated field. Immigration has usually been this, if you were to ask people what drives immigration policy in the United States, what is the thing, why do we care about immigration? Some people would tell you, because it's important for diversity, because we get new people, because a lot of entrepreneurship. Others would say it's a huge problem because, it's changing society too quickly. There's no control. But none of those are economic arguments, except maybe the entrepreneurship question. But the reality is we're going to have immigration conversations in the context of our future economy, right? And Mexico is not far. Mexico is going to have to do that as well, actually. They're going to need people at some point. Not all jobs will survive. Some jobs will, be mechanized, but some jobs will have to be done by human beings. Think of, care work, construction, innovation, in the whole sort of high-tech world. There's a whole set of things, parts of agriculture, some can be mechanized, some can't. So all of that's going to be, part of the future. I suspect if we don't create the legal mechanisms for people to come, you will see people going around the legal mechanisms. I do think the proliferation of possibilities for people to come legally to the U.S. has probably driven down the number of Mexicans that would come unauthorized. But there's also questions of matching. I remember spending time in one community in Puebla, on the border between Puebla and Hidalgo in Mexico, and I started asking about, has anyone here gone as a temporary worker to the U.S.? No, there's no recruiters there, right? So if you're from there, your chance of getting into a legal immigration stream, unless you have a relative but this is a place that didn't have a lot of migration to the U.S. originally, right? So there are not a lot of people that fit in that category for the green card. There aren't recruiters, so they can't get into the temporary streams, either the seasonal streams. So, it's helpful, but it's not decisive. It's not decisive alone, right? Because it is a question of matching.
One more quick question for you, Andrew, before I turn to the questions from the audience, and those are beginning to stack up. You didn't say too much about humanitarian parole. You didn't say much about temporary protected status. So I wonder how does this fit into your thinking about what's going on now, the future of the labor market, people who are allowed to stay for a while, allowed to work, and now their status is being revoked. And you mentioned that we have a big adjustment of status system in this country where over time people do find a way to get legalized or regularized. So what's going to happen with this whole category of people who are in limbo right now.
So we do actually have in the paper, we actually, this was done still during the Biden administration, we did look at the humanitarian parole categories and CBP1 and the sponsorship categories. And I think we mentioned TPS in there maybe, but we don't really calculate numbers because TPS, temporary protected status, is given once you're in the United States. We were looking at pathways for coming to the US. The reality is, we have probably 1 million or so people who had some sort of temporary status and have lost it in the past 6 months, right? And probably a few more people. One of the things that's happening right now also is that the government is closing cases, deportation cases, which sounds like when people hear that, they rejoice for the first time. But actually, the reason they're doing it means if they have an asylum application, that also goes away, right? So immediately their deportation, if they were apprehended crossing the border, they go into a defensive asylum docket, which means they're in deportation proceedings, but they can apply for asylum. If their deportation proceedings goes away, if the charge of, then they also lose the asylum case, and people don't realize that. So it's hard to know exactly how many people have lost status of some sort, but it is a very large number of people. I think we're going to feel it in the workforce. I don't think there's some studies that said that 1.5 million people left the country. That doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, I think that's the CPS. The numbers, suggest that, but it's not. I think that's underreporting probably because we haven't seen in Mexico and Central America the huge numbers of people coming back yet. So it would be unlikely that would be the case. But I do think we've lost, 1 billion or more people who had the right to work in the United States and no longer do. They lost temporary protection, lost humanitarian parole. Their asylum case was closed. I think at some point, the fact that there's very few people crossing the border anymore unauthorized means that will be less of a subject in the future. And the fact that we've taken people out of the labor market, at least out of the formal labor market, and we're not growing as a country without immigration means that we're likely to have this conversation about the workers we need sooner rather than later. And I don't know if that happens during the Trump administration. President Trump himself a couple times has talked about, I think 4 times that I've counted, has talked about needing workers in certain sectors and hospitality and agriculture. But it may not happen in this administration, maybe the next administration.
Okay, well, let's go quickly to the questions. There was a question from Daniel Guerrero about the TN visas, but he said you answered his question.
Oh, that's good. Okay, I could read your mind, Danielle. Yes.
Yeah.
We're connected.
We have a question here from Aren Cambre, who wants to know intriguing economic lowercase libertarian cases for open borders. But what about the big national security concerns? How would we manage national security issues if we go to more open borders? That's a question.
I mean, I'm not an open borders proponent. Sorry, we live next to this is my office. This is Migration Policy. We're next to the fire station. So if you hear that in the background, that's it's not our building burning down, but we're glad they're off taking care of someone else. I'm not an open borders person. I believe states, the rise of states means that there's you want a certain degree of control over who's coming in. I think for national security reasons, for economic reasons to monitor, and really for reasons of public trust. My sense is, when borders are seen by the public as being out of control and that there's no systematic order for how people come in, it actually creates legitimate pushback because people feel like there isn't a system. Right, and the government is not able to do some of its most basic functions, and you lose public trust. And I do think that is. I don't think that justifies the opposite reaction, and then trying to not have people come because we do need workers, and people should be reunited with their loved ones, and we should have some protection. But I do think there's, I think it is a problem to think that we should not take care of who comes across borders. And it also just undermines the legal immigration system you have, right? I mean, I've had more conversations with immigrants who have said to me, I had to wait for 10 years to get my visa. How are people walking across the border, right? So it just undermines legitimacy. There's an economic argument for it, right? Which is if you left all borders open, people would go where the jobs are, they would sort of equal out over time. But I think that's a hard thing to do in practice. And so, and it's certainly in a world where dangerous things can move across borders as well would be really untenable.
Okay, we have a question here from someone that we both know very well.
Yeah.
I guess I could call him a compañero, an amigo, a guy named Alfredo Corchado.
Alfredo.
Curious, he says, what industries are especially hard hit with the current ICE raids? He mentions dairy, service, agriculture, construction, and what industry is particularly hurting these days?
You know, it's hard to know. Hey, Alfredo, good. I guess I can't see you actually, but good to know you're there, and we need to catch up, or we need to run into each other in a random spot on Earth as we did last time.
I assume he's in El Paso. That's where
I'm assuming so. Although with Alfredo could be anywhere. So
could be
yes.
anywhere. That's true.
Alfredo is, among other things, the author of two fabulous books that you should look at. One called Homelands, about living between the U.S. and Mexico, about four friends who meet one night in Philadelphia at a restaurant, a rainy night in Philadelphia at a restaurant, and then share their journey of being part Mexican, part American throughout their life and careers. It's really just a beautifully written book. And Midnight in Mexico, if you're interested in Mexico specifically, about many things in Mexico, but particularly about public security. So, okay, Alfredo, I don't know we know the answer to that. We are seeing by our count, and Homeland Security statistics have been few and far between lately. Homeland Security was putting out of their Statistics Institute, they were putting out a really robust set of numbers every month. That has not happened since December. For whatever reason, the Trump administration appears to have decided not to release them. So we have to take a lot of things based on speculation, based on press releases, based on comments and interviews. It is hard to track what the number of people being detained and deported is. We think it's up to around 900 a day detentions. The deportations are a smaller number. I mean, it is an increase over last year, but last year was a very low number. It's an increase over in recent history, no question. It's far short of the 3,000 number that we've heard the White House has wanted. And I say that because I'm never quite sure how to describe this. We're at a moment where the enforcement, the feeling of enforcement, immigration enforcement is everywhere, particularly depending where you live. But, I live in Washington, D.C., you're in El Paso, I'm not sure in Dallas actually, but probably don't feel as much. Chicago, LA. I mean, there really is a presence of ICE trying to detain people. But the numbers aren't huge yet, right? It doesn't mean they won't get huge. I suspect they will actually, but they're not yet so big that they're in and of themselves disrupting the economy. What we are seeing is that sometimes when rumors run, true or not, that ICE is someplace, people don't show up for work. I can tell you at schools, I mean, I can tell you the school where my kids go, that the kids are going to school, but the parents are not going to parent meetings. Right. Very hard for even parents who have legal documents, by the way. I mean, this is citizens. Yes. But people who have TPS, people who have, green cards are tending not to show up, much less those who are unauthorized. So, just seeing that. And I think that's true of jobs. Like there's a lot of sort of people not going to, they don't go to the field one day because there's a rumor that ICE is around. Could be true, could not be true, and then they lose a day, the farm loses a day's work, but they're back the next day or 2 days later. Right. So we're not yet at the point where we feel the massive disruptions in the economy, but I suspect that together with trying to tighten up some of the legal immigration, adding steps like social media reviews and additional interviews, for example, for certain kinds of visas and visa renewals, I think the cumulative and fear of some students of coming to the United States for fear of like having their visa revoked, I think we're going to see at some point, not very far down the road, some real pressures in the economy. And I think it's going to be where you see a lot of recent immigrants, right? It's going to be in agriculture, it's going to be in care work. It is going to be in construction, certainly. And, on the high end, people who will choose to go somewhere else are, people in the professions, engineering, innovation, where suddenly it's going to look good to go back to China and, take a lab there, or go back to India, or, take a job in the UK because you feel more secure about, I had a European colleague who was thinking about staying in the US tell me he had decided to go back to his home country because he just didn't want to be one of those people who gets stopped at the airport and maybe turned around and said, we really wanted, he and his wife really wanted to stay in the US, but they had decided they were going to move back. And look, these are people with great opportunities, high human capital, but they got scared off. So I think the accumulation of all this is going to matter within the next year or two. But I'm not sure we could say there's sort of a crisis in one sector yet, because they haven't gotten the numbers yet.
Yeah, there was a question from Hannah Ray Melis, but Andrew, I think you just answered her question. She wanted to know if all of the enforcement activity is having a chilling effect basically on authorized immigration.
Yes, it is. No
growing
question.
fears, anxieties among immigrant population.
No question.
Yeah.
No question. I mean, I think we're seeing that. I've been surprised by that, actually, how strong it is with people I know are authorized, and in some cases have green cards or even citizenship, but, look like the populations they're coming after, right? Look like they just don't want to be in public places because they don't want to be harassed, right? They don't, they wouldn't get sent back to another country, but they could end up in detention for a bit. So it does seem like there's a chilling effect. I think it's contextual, by the way. I mean, it depends, I'm in Washington, D.C., where there's really a conscious effort to try and crack down on people. We're seeing that in Chicago and LA and some other places, but it may not feel the same way everywhere, right? I suspect this is a textured reality in many places.
Well, I have a sort of a general question from one of our great friends and supporters here of the center, the Tower Center in particular, for Tariq Rajev. And
wonderful.
Tariq has a I won't get into Tariq's background, but he has a general question about timelines between applying for and obtaining visas. He doesn't say which visas in particular, and I don't know if you've tried to figure out a hierarchy of how hard it is to get this visa as opposed to that visa to get to the U.S. Is there any general statement you could make about this?
I do not. I know the American Immigration Lawyers Association has looked at this. I have a colleague, Julie Gillette, who knows this fairly well, but I know Ayla has looked at it in some detail. They track the times. It depends on the visa category. It depends on, and who you are within that, right? Which specific visa category within visa category. And it depends which country also, right? I mean, how fast they're processing.
Right.
And it depends on additional requirements that have been added, right? I mean, there's, the social media vetting for students, for example, is a big deal. Trying to, if you're a consular officer and you've been told to vet people's social media, that is going to throw a little bit of glue in the system to try and get people their visa before the university starts, right, or graduate school starts. So it can be, I've seen visas come through, for a spouse of a U.S. citizen, a green card come through really quickly, and there are some people who've waited for 20 years.
Well, we have another question
for other kinds of visas.
A question from an anonymous attendee. Do we have any breakdown by age of legal immigration from Mexico? Trying to ascertain how many are a result of family reunification as opposed to those who would just coming for work.
Good question. So, can I tell you about this? We did another project actually with SMU Mission Foods Center a few years ago. So we haven't updated this yet, Ariel and me, where we looked at the immigrants, Mexican immigrants coming to Texas and to the United States as a whole.
Yep.
What we found out is the more recent immigrants were more likely to be better educated. We're very, I think about a quarter, if I remember correctly, had a college degree, whereas the old immigration stream was only about 5% had a college degree. The newer streams in the past 5 years, I think it was, and this is probably 20, I want to say it's 2020 or so we did this. So, it was closer to 25%. I could be misquoting it. The paper is there though. So
it should be on our website.
It should be on your website. Yeah. So it was becoming a much more educated population. We don't know the breakdown, but we do know that there was a time when a majority of Mexican immigrants were unauthorized in the US. That no longer appears to be the case.
Yep.
Right. I mean, from other work we do looking at the unauthorized population, a majority of Mexican immigrants appear to have legal status. And that is a huge shift. And they're no longer the majority of the unauthorized population either. And that checks with things that the Pew Research Center does, and even the DHS data. I mean, yeah, it seems that Mexico, people are much more likely to be legal and much more likely to be better educated. It does not mean there aren't still people who've been arriving unauthorized. There still are today, by the way, even in small numbers. So yeah, but there's movement that direction.
Well, we've got another question here from a colleague, a friend, Madeline Zavodny, who has written
Madeline, hello there.
Lots of things with our friend, Dr. Pia Arrhenius at the Dallas Fed. And I just would put in a plug for a co-authored book Madeline wrote on the economics of immigration, which Pia and I used in our class last year. Very successfully, I might add, a great book.
Madeline does some of the most compelling research on immigration. So
yeah, and her question is pretty straightforward, although obviously not easy to answer. But she says, if a large share of immigration from Mexico and Central America will come through family sponsorship, how likely are those new migrants to meet employers' needs?
It's interesting. I mean, you know this better than me, Madeline, but that the U.S. immigration system is overwhelmingly based on family ties, right? Particularly permanent immigration is based on family ties. We're unique in the industrial world, and doing that, almost every other country at least tries to make it about employment first, or human capital, or something else, right? Something tied to the economy. The history of this is kind of interesting, actually. There's a great book called Once a Mighty Tide, I think it is, by a New York Times reporter, and a very good book. And she actually walks through the history of this. You think this is sort of about Americans loving family, but actually the real history is, they had, in fact, in 1965 crafted an immigration system in the sort of the light of the civil rights movement, and also a lot of pressure to actually, seem like a more open society in the middle of the Cold War towards a lot of East Asian countries who had very little access to legal visas. And so they come up with a bill that prioritizes employment-based immigration, has family as the second category. However, one of the committee chairs, I believe in the House, who has to sign off on this, does not want to change the racial composition of the United States, and so insists that family be first, because that will keep America white. Because since most immigrants recently, in his estimation, are white, that is likely to actually be the ones that come. It turns out that doesn't work very well, as we all know, because in fact there had been immigrants coming from Latin America and the Caribbean legally, and so the numbers do change. And increasingly Europeans don't want to come to the U.S. Their economies are doing much better. In the 60s, they're in the post-war boom, and so we ended up with this system that is really based on family. And yet, at the same time, it actually works in its own weird way.
Let me see if I can squeeze in a few more questions.
But it's not the way to select human capital, right? I mean, it works, and the family tie. Look, what works in the U.S., as you know, Madeline, is people have like their own integration system because they come with family ties. That's really good. That doesn't necessarily hold elsewhere. What doesn't work is we're not really selecting people for skills or talent or particular needs in the economy. And I think somewhere there we have to have a serious conversation.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to quickly just a few more questions, and you can take these as quickly as you can. If you can't do them all, we'll skip them. Patricia Kriska wanted to know about the TN visas and which sectors, which industries are using the TN visas. Juan Yaramillo wants to know what about DACA and what's happening with that program, how's that affecting the job markets. Our friend Daniel Guerrero came back. He asked about TN visas, but he wants to know if we can look at the distribution of visas by Mexican states. The border states, are they getting more of the visas, and anything related to where the Mexicans are coming from? And then there was also a question about birthright citizenship. I don't think we're probably not going to get to that, but those are just a few things. If you want to quickly address those, where the TN.
We'll do a roundup. Yeah, so we don't have much data on where the TN visa holders come from. You probably need to do a survey on that. I mean, that data exists in the U.S. government, right? Because they have addresses, but it's not something that they compile and publish, so we don't know the answer to that. They are a wide variety of professions, from nursing to to innovation, tech innovation, to nonprofits, to, I mean, there's a list actually of what's allowed, but it's a fairly broad list, and you can
They're
often
predominantly Canadian.
Yeah, predominantly Canadian, right? Predominantly Canadian. But, and by the way, Canadians also have a NAFTA visa for Mexicans. You know, that it's a reciprocal thing among the three countries. Mexico has it for Americans and Canadians in theory, although Mexicans use the same visa actually. But there's a special sort of appreciation. See if it's Americans and Canadians. They didn't create a new visa category, however.
Thoughts about DACA?
And DACA is in peril. DACA is holding so far. Politically, it would be, I think President Trump actually has realized that it would be politically damaging to get rid of it, but there is a case, you know, winding its way through the courts on DACA, and the courts could indeed decide that it was an unreasonable use of executive authority. And the question then is, you know, will Democrats and Republicans try and save it, right? I mean, the tendency is for Republicans to try and make the issue smaller, Democrats try and make it bigger, and then everything blows up. And the question is, can they have a negotiation around that? And I don't know the answer to that.
What about
Birthright citizenship? We saw the court make a procedural determination. The Supreme Court sent it back to, I believe, the Circuit Court or the Appeals Court, I'm not sure which one, and it will come back to the Supreme Court in a few months, probably for a decision on the merits, and we'll see what happens. I suspect it will. The Constitution seems awfully clear to me on this, which does seem to allow for birthright citizenship, but, you know, far be it from me to predict the outcome of the Supreme Court decision.
Unfortunately, on that note, we're out of time, and I want to invite Courtney Weeks to rejoin the conversation here as we wrap this up. And of course, we want to encourage you all to visit the Texas Mission Foods Texas Mexico website. You will learn lots of things, and we'll be doing more programs in the future here, more research. So Courtney, would you like to say a few farewell remarks here?
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and especially Dr. Selee for this fantastic presentation and for your research. And as Dr. Hollifield mentioned, this will be posted on our website soon, and you can find more of Dr. Selee's work also on our website. So please check it out. Check out our other research that we've done. And this has been recorded, and if you'd like to review, we'll share it as well. So thank you so much for coming, Dr. Selee. It was a pleasure. We appreciate you, and we're excited to get this posted on our website.
I would just add too that the Migration Policy Institute is the greatest research institute in the world, I think, working on migration. There is so much that you can find there. It is a fantastic resource. And I really want to tip my hat to Dr. Selee and his colleagues at MPI for the work that they do, which is really, it's a global institute working with the four corners of the world, and just a fantastic resource. And we're delighted to be able to collaborate with you and MPI.
Thank you. Well, that means a lot coming from the foremost expert on migration policy, Dr. Hollifield. So
okay. Thank you. All right. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah. Bye-bye.